Hello, I'm Ollie and this is Criminally, where I talk about crime, pulp, horror, that kind of thing. Today I'm going to talk to you about why I don't like science fiction and fantasy. Now, this is an understanding about my own personal taste that I've only come to really recently. So if you'd asked me like a month ago, do you like science fiction and fantasy? I would have said, yeah, definitely. Not, maybe not as much as crime, pulp and horror, but I do like them. And as a teenager, I loved sci-fi and fantasy. I was really into sci-fi and fantasy. In fact, that was probably most of what I read. With horror a very close second, and over the years, horror, as I moved into my 20s, I guess horror kind of overtook sci-fi and fantasy. What I've realised more recently is there's something about not all sci-fi and fantasy, but a lot of sci-fi and fantasy that I find a real blocker to my enjoyment of the books. And a book I read earlier this month, Elder Race by Adrian Tchaikovsky, helped me to really identify what that thing is. So this video is about that. It's about the thing I don't like about a lot of sci-fi and fantasy. So, and I thought I'd have a look back through my Goodreads and see how much stuff that sci-fi and fantasy I've read this year. And I've read, I reckon, about 150 books. It's a bit hard to say exactly because I don't want to count multiple manga volumes individually, if that makes sense. And they show up individually on Goodreads. So when I look at my total for the year, which is 194, that includes like 6 volumes of Berserk or whatever. So I want to try and count Berserk as only one volume. So I think if I take out multiple volumes of the same manga series, it's probably around 140, 150. And I think 9 of those are what I would say is sci-fi or fantasy. Those 9 things are Elder Race by Adrian Tchaikovsky, which I've just talked about, which is a book that definitely contains the thing that I don't like about sci-fi and fantasy. Berserk, the manga, which I don't think does contain the thing I don't like. Attack on Titan, the manga. A book called Out on a Limb by an author called Louis Paredes, which I enjoyed. The Salt Grows Heavy by Cassandra Core. The Monk and Robot books, so 2 of those by Becky Chambers. The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch by Philip K. Dick. Snow Crash by Neil Stevenson, and The Midwich Cuckoos by John Wyndham. Now, a lot of those books I really enjoyed. And the ones I didn't enjoy, of those books, I think I gave 4 stars to all of them apart from Elder Race. And Elder Race I gave 3 stars to. And Elder Race is definitely the one that most prominently has this thing I don't like. So let me tell you what that thing is. I think the easiest way to describe it is world building. So world building is a phrase that people use a lot when they talk about sci-fi and fantasy, and a thing they praise authors for. So that technique of being able to create, a new world, a new society, and pull your readers into it. And the reason I don't like that, even when it's done really well, is, and I think in the Tchaikovsky book, for example, it was done pretty well. The reason I don't like it is I find it to be another thing that I need to figure out when I'm reading a book, if that makes sense. So this may sound really lazy, but I find it sometimes it just requires additional effort to figure out what the author is trying to tell me about this world that they've created. Whereas if I read a book that's set in the real world or something very like the real world, it's a lot easier for me to just get into the story and the characters, because I don't have this blocker of having to understand how everything else works before I can even start enjoying the story. And that for me does feel like a barrier I need to get through with these books. So I was thinking about, what are the things that make up a book? So particularly a novel, what are the things that make up a novel? And I think there's 5 things. And this is just me off the top of my head. So there may well be more well thought through lists. But I think the 5 things are setting, characters, plot, prose and subtext. So setting being, fairly obviously, where is the book set? And that's where, that's of the 5 things, that's the thing that world building would fall into most neatly. So you've got setting, characters, obviously the characters, plot, the storyline, the plot of the story, how things develop. Prose, so how is it written, how well is it written, is it a prose style that I engage with as a reader? And then subtext, which is kind of everything else, the meaning that the author is trying to get across beneath beneath those other four things. And I think that world building can kind of leach into subtext a bit as well. So quite often, I think with sci-fi and fantasy stuff, authors are trying to get across a particular message, and they often do that through the world that they create, through the society that they make. So think of 1984, like the classic example of that a lot of the subtext of the book is contained in the setting and the world that Orwell creates. So the things I really like about books out of those five are probably characters and plot. They're probably my favourite things. I do quite like a bit of subtext, but I'm not too bothered about it. But really, it's the characters and the plot that draw me into a book. The prose is important as well. It needs to be something that I find pleasurable and easy to read, but it's the characters and plot that really pull me in normally. And setting can be important, but I like my setting to be easy. I like it to be a setting that I can immediately understand. And that's why I think, I'm particularly drawn to crime fiction, because it tends to have, well, it pretty much always has a real world setting, and it often has a contemporary setting. So it's very easy for me to fall into the world of a crime novel, if you like. And I do like, I do think, setting, even in a real world setting where there's no, world building as such, I think setting can be done well or it can be done badly. And I think often crime novels are located in a particular city, so you quite often get a series that's set in a particular city. And when that's done well and really gives you a flavour of the city, that can be a really fantastic thing. But for me, where the author has to, create that city and the country and the society that it exists in, that's when it starts becoming a blocker for me. And I definitely found that with Elder Race, the Tchaikovsky book. It was just, there was too much stuff I needed to figure out before I could get into the characters and the story and things like that. And, there's been a few kind of sci-fi fantasy things that I've DNF'd, recently, which were things I had really, really high hopes for and really expected to like, because so many people whose opinions I respected had raved about them. So two things in particular. So The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie comes to mind, and the Broken Earth series by N.K. Jemisin. So both of those people have really raved about, and with both of them I found it was that need to get into this world and understand how it functions that for me was the barrier. And I find sometimes when I'm reading a book like that, I'm using too much of my brain to focus on the world and understanding the world, and I don't have enough brain left over to get to know the characters and absorb the story. And therefore, given that characters and story are the things I really enjoy in a book, I don't get into the book and I don't get pleasure out of it. And if I look at that list of books I've read recently, sci-fi and fantasy books that I've given 4 stars to, a lot of them have a real world setting or something that's very close to a real world setting, rather than something like Elder Race, which is a completely fantastic setting. So like Snow Crash is, when it came out, it probably didn't feel like a recognisable world, but very much about like the metaverse and things like that. In fact, coined the phrase the metaverse, so it felt quite accessible to me. The Midwich Cuckoos is set in 1950s Britain. Out on a Limb by Lou Paredes has a very much an urban setting, so something weird about the society, but it's still kind of a real world setting. It's like the real world, but some strange thing has happened. And the Monk and Robot books as well do have they are the most extreme in terms of their world building. Probably not as extreme as Elder Race, but certainly more extreme than the other things which I have enjoyed. But there's something about the way Becky Chambers does it that works for me. There's a simplicity to the world that she creates that it just, that one did work for me. So it can, books with a lot of world building can work for me. But yeah, I guess they don't always. And I'm struck by the fact that both the Monk and Robot books are very short. They're practically novellas. So Becky Chambers manages to do that world building in a very short number of pages, rather than taking up loads and loads of pages that stop you from getting to the story. Another one I'm struck by is Berserk. So Berserk, he's set in a fantastic world, but it's a fantastic world that basically feels very much like medieval Europe. So it's while there are some fantasy elements, they are few and far between. And therefore, I find it a lot more accessible. And I'm considering as well, or have been considering, Game of Thrones, so the Song of Ice and Fire books by George R.R. Martin, which are, he's often praised for his world building of those books. But when you think about it, I'm not convinced there is much world building in those books, because what he's basically done is taken the world as it is, or was, a few hundred years ago, and a lot of the countries and areas in the Song of Ice and Fire books are recognisable as countries from our own world. So you get parts of England and the Middle East, and he uses things that are familiar to us but makes them seem somehow fantastic, which I think is a real skill. And I think he does it very well, because you feel like he's created a world, but as I say, I'm not really convinced he has. So this is, as I say, an awareness about my own taste that I've only come to very recently. But I think I'm definitely more drawn to sci-fi and fantasy books when they don't have a lot of world building in, when they use settings that are more like the real world, and therefore have less of that barrier for me to get into the story. They're just my thoughts on that, and my thoughts on my own personal taste. But do let me know what you think. I know there are loads of people out there who love fantasy books with really detailed and extensive world building. But I think I've decided it's just not for me. But if you can think of some examples where it's done particularly well, and in particular, I guess, particularly briefly, then let me know. Maybe I'll give those a try and see if I'm wrong about my own tastes. So anyway, hope you found that interesting. And as always, thank you very much for watching. Hope you're safe and well out there. Hope you're really good stuff. And I'll speak to you again very soon. Cheerio.